crises. In the late 19th century, a prohibitive budget deficit thrust the country of Poland into one of the worst economic meltdowns in the history of the world. It was known as the crisis of 1899. In 1929, fears and predictions that such a crisis could hit the United States were dispelled with the notion that we're not in a crisis, we're in a depression. And such was born the Great Depression. So as you see, the nomenclature of government and institutions tries to reduce the difficulty and the magnitude of economic problems. And so now, our problems are not described as a depression, but a recession. Recession is next door. When you're the one who's lost their home and their job, that's starting to feel like a depression. And the reality is that this is where New York State can move this year if we don't act, and act now. People in Brooklyn, people across this state are suffering. The mortgage foreclosure crisis is in full effect right here in New York. And over 300,000 New Yorkers have lost their jobs since the beginning of this great recession. I've been fighting for the people of the state of New York, along with my colleagues in the legislature. We passed last year and this year landmark mortgage foreclosure prevention legislation that now defines what is a legal mortgage and what is predatory lending. The latter will subject the perpetrators to criminal penalties. We have used stimulus dollars to try to create jobs in the midst of this economic crisis. We have looked past the recession to recovery and have begun job creation in clean energy, broadband, information services, and biotechnology. We have leveled the playing field for minority and women-owned businesses in just under 2 years. And we haven't forgotten about those who are hardest hit and originally hit whenever there's an economic turndown. And they are those who live on the line of survival in our society. That's why for the first time in 20 years, we increased the welfare grant for the afflicted individuals involved. We increased food stamps by 30%. There are $100,000 employees last year who were on food stamps this year. We increased unemployment insurance from 26 weeks to 59 weeks. We increased COBRA benefits. That's the health insurance when you leave your job from 18 months to 36 months. We have tried as hard as we could in the midst of our economic crisis to remember those who don't have a voice but are hardest hit by it. But unfortunately, we've also made some decisions that you will raise today and which you raise rightly. And on the merit of the issues, I'm telling you in advance, you are right. We have, in my administration, in just under 2 years, cut $4.5 billion from health care. We've cut $1.1 billion from education. We've cut our administration, our agencies, by $1.5 billion. And in this year's budget, we're going to cut it some more, unfortunately. We're going to have to cut health care another $1 billion, education a 5% reduction at $1.1 billion, and another $1 billion from our agencies, including $250 million from workforce reduction. We are going to make cuts that if you told me years ago that I was going to be governor and I'd be making those kind of cuts, I probably wouldn't have believed either. But the reality is that there are pieces of legislation I introduced that I've had to veto because we don't have the money. And what I came here to tell you today is that we are crossing that Rubicon between recession and something else far worse if my colleagues in the legislature and I can't close a $9.2 billion deficit. Now, we had an $18 billion deficit that we closed last year, but we had more options. We have used them up. We've depleted our resources, and I came here to tell you that. That isn't popular, but it is the truth, and I wanted you to know that. We will be open-minded because this is such a prohibitive situation that your suggestions may help us. We are willing to be flexible, but I just caution that wherever we save a program or save resources, we're going to have to find that money to replace the balancing of the budget. And so we're open to your suggestions, but what we also need to hear is, how do we pay for it? We recognize that the engine of our economy lies in our youth. The catalyst for our next generation's progress is in our public higher educational systems. We don't want to reduce them, and yet we've had to again. But that doesn't make fiscal sense, and yet we have to do it because we're up against the possibility of the state running out of money in May or June.
This is Attorney Smith for Issues in Focus at New York's Brooklyn Borough Hall.
But it hasn't stopped.
You have heard the
Recently,
same.
I've been also
They have come
the
to
target
Caesar
of
not to praise
special
him.
interest
The governor is here
$8
on the
million
fire to
of it,
resign,
but it hasn't stopped.
but as you can see,
And I've
he's
also
standing
been the
strong
target of a
and
lawsuit
cool
when I took
in
an
the midst
action
of
to
all
prevent the
this.
state
This is
from
his
running
address
out of
at
money
Borough Hall.
last December, but that hasn't stopped. It hasn't stopped me from getting up 2 months into my administration and announcing that we had the devastating fiscal problems that we actually do. It didn't stop me from introducing my budget 5 weeks early last year to try to alert the public that we had to address this problem. It didn't stop me from breaking 200 years of uncertainty and appointing a lieutenant governor to stop the problem in the Senate last summer that was inhibiting government. And it didn't stop me from closing $33 billion worth of deficit over the last 2 years.
No questions and resignation.
The real victims here are those who unfortunately are having to suffer because we didn't make the responsible decisions years ago. In the last 5 years, spending has gone up annually, the last 5 years before I became governor, that is. Spending went up 8% on average for those 5 years, but revenue production only went up 3%. We unfortunately spent more and more on healthcare and education, and we also spent more to pay for our debts that we'd run up in the past, and also to pay for pensions. The result was that we finally hit the wall. The day of reckoning is actually here. And so many are going to have to pay the price that poor judgment could not alleviate years ago. Instead, what we did is we papered over deficits. We squandered surpluses.
This is the end of part one of Governor Paterson remaining cool while Albany and others demand his resignation. I am Verna Smith, and this has been Issues in Focus, part one on Governor Paterson under pressure. Thank you.
We have people losing their jobs. We even have some people losing their homes. Entire regions of this state struggling for survival. Children beginning to go hungry. And this is what happens to entities, to states, to governments that don't come to grips with the problems. We're coming to grips with the problem, and we're bringing it right back to you, the public, who has a right to know.